Hello, I'm Nancy Clark, Community Relations Manager in University Libraries. Thank you for joining us today for the University Library Association and University Libraries webinar, Build, Not Burn, Woodstock West and the University of Denver. A special welcome to ULA members, Pioneer alumni legends, and the class of 1970 who would have been joining us on campus next month to celebrate their 50th reunion. We will look forward to seeing you next year. Today, you will be hearing from Kate Crowe, Associate Professor and Curator of Special Collections and Archives. Following the lecture, Professor Nanda will give an account of his experience at the law school during the demonstration, and will end with a question and answer panel where Dr. Sheila Schroeder and 1970 DU graduate Jim Wagenlander will join us. I will moderate the questions. Please use the chat feature on the toolbar of Zoom to ask your questions and indicate if they are addressed to a specific panelist. It's my privilege to briefly introduce our panelists. Kate Crowe is an Associate Professor and Curator of Special Collections and Archives at the University of Denver, where she is responsible for the acquisition and curation of primary resource collections, permanent university records, and special and rare materials. Nanda is a Distinguished University Professor and Thompson G. Marsh Professor of Law at the University of Denver, where he founded the International Legal Studies Program in 1972 and now directs the Nanda Center for International and Comparative Law. For the past 21 years, Dr. Sheila Schroeder has been a professor of film studies and production at the University of Denver. She has done extensive research on Woodstock West and is working toward a film documenting the events. Jim Wagenlander was a student leader at DU and the author of the Woodstock Chronology, which was commissioned by DU. In the fall of 1970, he went on to Case Western Reserve Law School, returned to Denver after law school, and soon founded Wagenlander and Heisterkamp, a small law firm which he has been a managing shareholder of for 44 years. Before we start the program, please welcome Michael Levine Clark, Dean of University Libraries.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all for joining our second ULA and University Library Zoom lecture. When we closed the library and closed the campus and commenced what we were calling social distancing, but really is more appropriately physical distancing, we were really worried about what it would be like to sort of maintain our community and connect with friends and colleagues. And it's really been wonderful to see that despite the fact that we are physically distant, we're not actually socially distant, and we're able to do events like this and get together. It's great to see so many people here today attending this lecture. We have over 200 people registered for this event. We're here to talk today about Woodstock West, which is one of the pivotal moments in DU's history. And whether you're learning about it for the first time today, or you were actually there in those events and are here to reflect and remember and reminisce, we're really glad to be able to share this event with you today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kate Crowe, who's gonna tell us about Woodstock West.
Thank you so much, Michael. All right, I am going to share my screen again. A second. Thank you again so much for being here today with us. I'm Kate Crowe. I'm the curator of, as Michael said, Special Collections and Archives, as well as the University Archivist for DU. And I'm so pleased that you're all here to join us, which is the 50th anniversary of what was the first day of Woodstock West. This photo that we're all looking at right now is from an alum, Richard Wahera, who managed to document nearly every aspect and every day of Woodstock West. And we'll see quite a few more of his images here as the lecture keeps going. So I'm so pleased that we worked it out so that we could be joined by Sheila, and Jim, all of whom are going to be able to provide us with their insights into this event, what it meant for DU, and how it continues to resonate on campus today. I will also say I was limited to putting this lecture together with parts of the archives that were available digitally, so I haven't been able to double and triple check sources. But hopefully you can see this as an opportunity to course correct me while we work on a physical exhibit that will be available in the next academic year. So the first image I want to show today is actually not of Woodstock West or really even that era. It's from the November 2016 protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the pipeline conference at the university, which was sponsored by one of the companies involved in the pipeline. And while it's important to consider that the Vietnam War era peace movement and the No DAPL movement, which is often shortened to, came out of really specific resistance movements that are different from one another, this 2016 protest has a lot of similarities to Woodstock West, and I think shows why why Woodstock West has such a resonance for contemporary DU students and faculty. In both examples, we have a local protest action connected to national and even international resistance movements. And in both cases, they feature student-led movements that were supported by faculty also agitating for change so that the university and the nation are pressured to live into their stated values. Woodstock West is 50 years ago, but it's not the first, and it's not going to be the last time students are making their voices heard. So in talking to Sheila and Jim and so many of the people who have reached out and shared stories and donated materials, including my dad, who is a librarian and is now retired, who was 25 and marching in the streets in Boston, and who signed up for this webinar today. So hi, Dad. Just how transformative and both transformative and traumatic this time was for the generation that lived through it. From JFK's assassination in 1963 until Nixon resigned in 74, there was really just this sense that the country was being torn apart. And correspondingly, there was also a sense of the moment having great historical impact. And as a result, this is one of the better documented parts of the university and the nation's history. I will also say that as somebody who uses a lot of these materials to teach and work with contemporary students in a variety of classes, in particular freshmen and writing classes, this era and these documents are among those that are the most resonant for today's students, and especially right now, but even in the last few years, who are experiencing a world that sees its own kinds of divisions. So related, this is a good time to make a pitch. Since archives can have such power to transmit history, I really encourage those of you who have any materials related to Woodstock West, so film, flyers, journals, consider donating them. The image you see here is a vignette of signs from the No DAPL protest we saw earlier, a die-in that was organized in 2014 by the Black Graduate Students Association, and the Women's March. And these are the kinds of things that we only receive if students, faculty, staff, and alums choose to donate. If you can either reach out to me directly at my email, which is Catherine.Crowe, Katherine, Crowe, or you can reach out to Nancy Clark, who's moderating, and she can forward them to me. I've already heard from some of you, and I so appreciate you reaching out. I would also ordinarily use this as a pitch to ask people to contribute funds to the archives, but I know right now, and I think it's far more appropriate for people to be donating to the Students Emergency Fund. So if you can, please consider donating. Okay, so we're gonna switch to the reason we're all here, which is the time leading up to what became Woodstock West. And as it makes sense, I'll try and pull in some contextual details. As most of you who experienced this period of time are hopefully aware, the history of US involvement in Vietnam and its connections to histories of US imperialism and to resistance movements in the US form the basis of some scholars' whole research careers. So for the sake of time, I'm going to try and keep us narrow, but pull in details as it's relevant. So in 1965, teach-ins began to crop up as ways usually for academic faculty to sort of along the same lines as sit-ins. So the first one was in Michigan, and then the largest, which was on the UC Berkeley campus, was between 20 and 30,000 in attendance. As you can see, the same year as the UC Berkeley sit-in, DU had one, but it was a much smaller event. But it did show that the DU campus was starting to think about how the peace movement was beginning to politicize this generation, and how faculty and students might begin to challenge the status quo in ways that were connected to national resistance and peace movements. And so campus was no means completely quiet between 65 and 67. It wasn't until early 67 that DU got its first chapter, I shouldn't say first chapter, its chapter of the organization Students for a Democratic Society. The chapter seemed to really struggle to find its footing initially. It went from having its charter revoked to being reinstated. And then it had what was a very well-attended event, 500 people, called Gentleness Thursday, which they were very clear was not a political or social protest, but was a chance for students to kind of build community and get to know each other. So in October of 1967, there was a rally organized by the DU SDS chapter that coincided with national anti-war rallies organized by the National Committee to End the War in Vietnam. And a DU student, Mendel Cooper, who was the child of Holocaust survivors, partially destroyed his draft card. Cooper was like some of the 1,400 that day who burned or otherwise mutilated their cards, brought up on charges. And at the time, the charge carried with it up to $10,000 and 5 years in jail, although very few people who were charged actually received jail sentences or were fined that amount. Cooper did go to trial and was found guilty in March of '68, but I haven't actually been able to find details about sentencing and what happened afterwards. So if you know, curious to know more. From fall of '67 on, SDS activities on campus seemed to be largely focused on a student bill of rights that had been ratified by the student body, but was ultimately voted down by the board, which led to a picket line at the March 12, 1968 Board of Trustees meeting. The major sticking point seems to have been Section 3, which was students have the right to fully participating membership with equal voice and vote on university committees and organizations that affect students' academic affairs. And I like that they added absolute authority over all university committees and organizations that affect the personal affairs of students. This quarter was also when Professor Nanda, who I'm hoping is going to talk about this a little bit more, offered a course on political and policy and legal underpinnings of the conflict in Vietnam. So very soon after this, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. King had come to campus twice, last time in May of 1967, to talk about his ongoing work for civil rights and combating poverty, as well as you can see here, encouraging students who attended to resist the draft. And King definitely gets mentioned in articles throughout the rest of the year, but the overwhelming emphasis seems to continue to be on the Students' Bill of Rights and anti-war activities. I would posit, I'm guessing, that this reflects kind of the relatively low percentage of Black students and kind of lack of racial diversity on campus. And these are racial dynamics that do definitely come into play during Woodstock West. 3 weeks after King's assassination, DU students attempted to pressure the Board of Trustees into greater autonomy and authority for self-government. The coverage of this particular event, which is a sit-in at the registrar's office, centers largely on the students' demands to allow a graduate student to run for election to the All Undergraduate Student Association, which largely seems to be a tactic designed to pressure the board, which had just voted down the Bill of Rights, to reconsider. But again, I would love it if you would fact check me. That is what it seems to be going on here, though. October 1968, obviously this was an election year, independent candidate for President George Wallace, who was called by Martin Luther King in 1965, perhaps the most dangerous racist in America today, attempted to give a campaign speech on the steps of the Denver Capitol building. And the DU chapter of Students for a Democratic Society and many other students and other protesters disrupted Wallace's speech, carrying signs likening him to, as you can see, Adolf Hitler, and shouting Sieg Heil. The protesters were ultimately so disruptive that Wallace was forced to leave the stage and abandon his speech. And in November of 1968, despite Wallace and Eugene McCarthy's best efforts, Nixon was overwhelmingly elected, having promised that he had a plan to get the US out of Vietnam. Nixon's emphasis on law and order and Southern strategy designed to win conservative Southern white voters went on to become the backbone of the modern Republican Party's strategy for presidential elections. After the election, there was a period of relative calm, obviously not total calm, partly because, like, as I said, my dad put it when we talked about it, people were just exhausted. Especially given the chaos of the Democratic National Convention in August, and there was some tentative hope that Nixon had a plan and that the US would ultimately end up being able to leave Vietnam. So during this period of relative calm, DU won its 5th national championship in men's ice hockey after beating Harvard and Cornell. And I found like this was important to include because DU hockey has, I think, really interesting history of Cold War era battles between Russian and DU hockey teams, DU and US hockey teams. DU played the Soviet Olympic team in one of a series of exhibition games in '59. And Russia tied both the US national and the DU hockey team. All the other teams who played them were annihilated. So again, speaks well for DU hockey. And the follow-up match in February of 1960 also resulted in a tie. The most famous US-Soviet hockey matchup is, of course, the Miracle on Ice at the 1980 Olympics, where assistant coach Craig Patrick, who was on this winning 1969 team pictured, helped lead the US Olympic team to victory over the Soviet Union, who were at that time 4-time defending gold medal winners. So in August of '69, the Woodstock Music Festival, from which Woodstock West gets its name, took place. So in addition to the name, the students who made up the Woodstock West community referenced Joni Mitchell's song, which was recorded by Crosby, Stills and Nash for their Deja Vu album, in the cover sheet for one of the statements of purpose for the community. Rumors about Crosby, Stills and Nash walking through Woodstock permeated the encampment through the last few days, but the band never ultimately materialized. So this is where things start to get a little bit darker and people begin to question Nixon's commitment to the peace rather than the war. So one of the first warning signs that Nixon, like many of his predecessors from both parties, was expanding rather than shrinking the US campaign in Vietnam was this reinstatement of the draft lottery in '69, which was the first time that had happened since World War II. But between this and Operation Menu, which was a series of punishing bombing raids along the Vietnam-Cambodia border between March and May of '69, it was really clear that things were getting worse and not better. So many universities, including DU, also saw students protesting about government contracts, funding, investment between US military and their institutions. These protests were usually connected to SDS and other kinds of student organized peace movement, and DU was not any different in that respect. So the university's primary connection to government contracts was the Denver Research Institute, which, like many others on the US college campus, had come out of World War II. DU's protests were small and fairly disorganized relative to those at larger institutions like the University of Michigan, which protested Dow Chemical for its connection and involvement to, again, providing the US Army with things like napalm. By the height of the Vietnam War, the US Department of Defense had spent close to $266 million on defense research within academic institutions. I will say that's a number that is dwarfed by current defense spending on academic campuses. So April 30th of 1970, Nixon made an announcement that US ground forces had invaded eastern Cambodia, and this expanded the war considerably. This and the reinstatement of the lottery made it really clear that rather than working for peace, Nixon was committed to enlarging the theater and scope of the war. Groups like the Rocky Mountain Peace Action Council, which produced this flyer and was organizing this event, and many other groups like it, started to agitate for protest and complete withdrawal of US troops from Southeast Asia. So now we're up to May 4th of 1970. So just after noon on May 4th, after several days of protests on Kent State campus in Ohio, the Ohio National Guard fired on a crowd of several thousand assembled students, killed 4, William Schroeder, Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, and Sandra Schur, and wounded 9, one of whom, Dean Collar, was permanently paralyzed. Faculty marshals were there and really worked to avoid further bloodshed, convincing the angry and grieving students who were demanding to know why the Guard had shot their friends to disperse. Campuses across the US, many of whom were already beginning to organized protests and actions in response to the invasion of Cambodia erupted. So on Tuesday of May 5th, the AUSA and Student Senate met and approved a 2-day strike on a 30-0 vote, as well as being in favor of the National Strike Association demands, which you see here: immediate unilateral US withdrawal from Southeast Asia, release of all political prisoners, and end to university complicity with war-related efforts, i.e. academic research working for the Department of Defense. Hundreds of universities, colleges, and high schools closed as nonviolent student protests involving more than 4 million students in total swept the country. On DU campus, about 1,500 students attended an 8 p.m. rally, and things were really just getting started. So on 8 a.m. the next day of Woodstock West, the day began, I wouldn't say inauspiciously, but with a relatively small protest. So about 30-ish picketers were in front of the general classroom building, which has since been renovated and is now called Sturm Hall. Students who were picketing were initially heckling and yelling at students who were entering to attend class, but they were, I think, largely convinced by protest organizers to stop, because the chancellor had given guidance that anyone who was interfering with campus activities could be suspended or expelled. And then by noon, the protest had grown to be about several hundred people. And then at 12:30, Black Panthers spoke in front of Ben Sherrington Hall, which is now part of the C International Relations Complex. The Clarion seems to indicate that at least a few of the Panthers speaking were also what was at the time called the Graduate School of International Studies, now called Corbell, students. So I would love to know more about that and names if anyone has them, because I don't have names, I just know Black Panthers. And by 2 p.m. the full rally had begun, also with Black Panthers as speakers. After the rally, the crowd partially dispersed to the chancellor's residence, even though the chancellor wasn't there, and most organizers knew he wasn't and tried to divert the crowd. Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs Blackburn, which I believe this is Blackburn, again, correct me if I'm wrong, addressed the crowd, and people eventually dispersed, with 15 or 20 sleeping on the Carnegie Green lawn. So the morning of May 7th, a group of concerned faculty, not faculty senate, just sort of 92 faculty, met to decide whether to support the strike, and ultimately voted to do so 83 to 4 to 5. This document shows some statements faculty were prepared to issue to the media, and how they wanted to support the students by marshaling, coordinating writing campaigns, providing a call list, and short and long-term support mechanisms. So making sure everybody can still see. So Ralph Nader had already been scheduled to speak that evening, and he did, to a crowd of several thousand. The night ended fairly quietly with a planned 10 a.m. convocation scheduled by Chancellor Mitchell the next day. So the convocation the next day opened with Assistant Dean John Rice, who may be better known to some of you as the father of Condoleezza Rice, who was an administrator at the time, and quickly moved on to the Chancellor, who spoke next and expressed the commitment of the university to remain open, which was, again, against the will of the students, as well as supporting the students who wished to strike, but being very clear that anyone who interfered with campus activities would be disciplined. Students alternately booed and jeered. Many left the arena angry and looking for some kind of, not a literal fight, but upset. So the students who gathered on the green promised instead to build, not burn, and started to assemble the shantytown that would become Woodstock West. So on May 9th, students from all different regional universities, Metro State, CU, CSU, DU, CU Law School, and a number of community members converged at 19th and Stout, which is the Denver Federal Center, and marched to the city capitol. The crowd, which started at about 10,000, grew to between 15 and 17,000. Several thousand of those marchers returned to Woodstock West, and many slept there overnight. Richard Wahera, who I mentioned earlier, took many photos of this downtown march, which I'm not able to share with you given time constraints, but I'm really hopeful we can include more of them in the physical exhibit we're working on. So the organizers were notified on May 10th that if they didn't disperse, essentially by Monday, May 11th, that Denver police would come and come with a temporary restraining order and require them to disperse. Not deterred, the organizers continued to expand the shantytown, which included coordination for waste, kitchens, ensuring rotations and leads for safety marshals, first aid, and legal observers. And by evening, all of the inhabitants were made aware that if they didn't start dismantling Woodstock West, that police would be called within 48 hours. And despite that, roughly 2,000 people were there, and many stayed overnight. So by 4 a.m. the next day, police began to mobilize and circle. By 6 a.m., most of the inhabitants had left, but several hundred were still there, and about 25 people, after having the restraining order read to them, agreed to be arrested rather than leave. By about 8 a.m., police started to tear down Woodstock West, and about 1,000 people were watching from across Evans, and the crowd started to grow over the course of the day. Despite police moving the crowd around and orders to use gas, gas wasn't used, and aside from a fair amount of heckling and yelling at the cops, the situation was relatively peaceful. Once the police finished demolishing everything, they left, and students started rebuilding. They started rebuilding Woodstock 2 as soon as the police left, and at about 3 p.m., the general faculty meeting voted to support the strike. That evening, Governor Love met with Mitchell and told him that if Woodstock West wasn't dispersed, he was going to call in the National Guard. At about 12:45 the next day, Governor Love spoke to the students, and by about 7 p.m., Mitchell decided to call in the Colorado National Guard. There were, according to some estimates, around 1,200 guardsmen, 200 police, and 200 Air National Guardsmen assembled in the neighborhood around Woodstock West. And the encampment was bulldozed, but the atmosphere was relatively friendly. Many of the guardsmen were also DU students, some of whom I've been made aware are on this call, so I hope I'm doing this justice for everyone who actually was there. So again, many of the guardsmen were also DU students, and things were relatively peaceful, but there were still about 40 arrests. By that evening, police and guard were still present, but most people had dispersed, and Woodstock West was, for all intents and purposes, dismantled. So I want to talk just a little bit about right after Woodstock West, but I want to leave kind of more big, broad questions to our panelists. So a little bit about, I think, some important counter narratives to the sort of chronology and narrative that I just presented. This is a policy that the TU Black Student Alliance put together in response to the strike. They were, again, expressing solidarity with the people of Cambodia who were being bombed and invaded at that point. But they also wanted to really call out their white classmates for failing to rise to the occasion when, in the examples that they're using, Black students at HBCUs experienced police violence, fighting racism and protesting for peace. And it's also important to note that on March 14th, which was the day after Woodstock West came down, 2 students were killed at Jackson State, which was an HBCU and, historically Black college or university. And these killings received significantly less coverage than the 4 white students killed at Kent State. This sentiment continues to surface throughout the remainder of the 70s as the university continues to work to racially diversify its student body and its faculty. It's also worth noting, I think, and I definitely noticed this as I was putting this together, there are very few women who are in leadership positions during the strike. And that's something that would go on to be somewhat unthinkable as the women's rights movement progressed. So in June, The chancellor did not ultimately shake hands with or sign the diplomas of any of the graduating seniors, purportedly to avoid future confrontations. Many seniors wore armbands and black armbands in lieu of caps and gowns, and there were 2 funds graduating students were asked to contribute to instead of purchasing caps and gowns. And you can see an example of a national fund, which I believe is connected to this effort as well. So I am now going to turn things over to Professor Nanda, who was present during Woodstock West as a faculty member, and I cannot wait to hear what he has to share with us.
Ved, can you unmute your computer? We can't hear you.
My apologies, I was on mute, and I just wanted to thank the library, Nancy, for putting the program on. And Professor Crowe, you did such a comprehensive and wonderful work. And thank you very much for relating it, because it really helped a lot for people to provide a context for it. I need to go back, and permit me just very briefly, because during my time at Yale, Vietnam was a major issue, and I was the president of our student body of World Community Association. This was the International Law Society. And at that time, we had 2 issues that were main. One was Vietnam, and the other one was apartheid. And on both of them, Yale Law School students and Yale University students took a very, very good stand. And then I came to the University of Denver in 1965. And as Professor Crowe mentioned, I had Vietnam law and policy on that war, a program at the law school. It was a credit-bearing course, but along with about 50 law students, I permitted at that time the community members to come in for lectures, for debates. So that is the kind of background and setting. When Kent happened, at that time, there was a great deal of stir at the law school also. A couple of my colleagues, they were very, very much involved in Woodstock West because they were there trying to mediate. I was not one of them, but I was there, and my job simply was to teach in, talking about Vietnam and talking about the legal and policy issues. But Chancellor Mitchell was very kind and gracious, and he wanted to talk with me occasionally about what was happening at the university as a student leader. And so I talked with him, and I think he was scared because he was afraid that at the university also things would happen as had happened in many places. And when students initially had talked about burn, 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 and then a friend of mine that now for a long time, and who was a leader at that time, and who was the one who was trying to find a way to pacify, and one of those people who said, let's build and not burn. So Jim Wagenlander would talk about it. But I had been there talking with Mitchell, and I just mentioned to him, he obviously was scared, and that is why that effort had been futile on the part of my colleagues to find a peaceful settlement. I would be glad to talk more, but I've got 2 other friends who are here and who were there at that time as students. So I think, Kate, we probably listen to them, or you ask any questions. And there's plenty more, but I don't want to monopolize. I want to leave time for them and for you. But I'll be happy to interject because there is so much at that time that as you started talking about it, I go back, and both at the law school, because law school was 6 miles away, but at the same time, because I taught also at Cornell. When I came from Yale, I started teaching at the law school full time, but from the very beginning, I was teaching at Cornell International Law, and from that time on, international human rights. I have continued, and even today, I teach their students at the law school. So I'll be happy to interject, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Fed. I want this to be as conversational as possible while realizing that there's limitations of the medium, that I don't want people to feel like they're talking over each other or that you have to listen to us talking over each other. So I'm going to start with Jim Wagenlander. I'm really curious. So I get asked by students who work with the materials, who are themselves, incoming new freshmen, and I realize this is an enormous question, but just what was it like? And what would you want to convey to current students at DU? What the event was like?
Well, that's, before I answer that, I just want to thank you and everybody in this, on this webinar, and to the university for remembering 50 years later what happened. I happen to believe it was a pivotal moment for the university. I think it began to instill in the university the importance of values, advocacy, and community engagement. It was a pretty exciting time. It was an important time for many people, because it was sort of the culmination of the civil rights movement, campus rights, anti-war, and it became far more dramatic than anybody had ever imagined it would be. I really underscore what Ved said about Chancellor Mitchell being a little scared. Everybody was scared. Since this really blew up, it had been simmering, as you well depicted, for some time, but it blew up with the killing of the 4 students at Kent State. And everybody was afraid what would happen when police or troops would come onto the campus. And from the administrators like John Blackburn and Jim Kaufman and Dean Rice and John Millay, to the student leadership, to, I would dare say, even the small radical organizations that were engaged, there was great fear that a similar tragedy could occur. But it didn't deter the students from asserting what we felt was a very important issue, and that was to strike and to be effective in voicing our opinion. And I think that became an additional part of the conflict. Maurice Mitchell, who I had worked for before, was a good friend of, and later continued that friendship, took a route that was to deny that the students were on strike. That it's like a company saying when their laborers go on strike that there is no strike. And that created a real anger because it was the voice that the students were trying to give to their opinions that was further denied. I think it's important to point out that Maurice Mitchell was more than a university president. He was a pretty political figure within the state. And in fact, there are many interesting elements to what was going on, but there was a little bit of a uncomfortableness between him and John Love, the governor. And that those things came out during the demonstrations in the act. But it was a very emotional time, and everybody was doing what they could to keep it from exploding and having violence.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I also wanted to talk to Sheila Schroeder about this a little bit, because I think it was mentioned in the bio in the introduction, but Sheila's been making a documentary with the sort of same title as this lecture about this event. And I have sort of a 2-part question. So what drew you to it? And then sort of a similar question to the one that I just asked Jim, which is sort of, you have talked to so many people who were involved in this event and this, you know, period of time in the university's history. What sort of, if you had to encapsulate what you hear from people who were there, what it was like?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to run a class where students were pitching ideas for a video magazine, and two of my students came to me and said, "Hey, we want to do this story on Woodstock West." And I said, "Well, what is that?" And this is about 1999, a couple of years after I had arrived at DU, and in fact, I believe, Jim, you were part of that, that student production, about a 5-minute piece. And I immediately became intrigued. I had taken some classes during my undergraduate years at Valparaiso University on Vietnam. And I recognized fairly quickly that this was a very large project, and being pre-tenure at the time, it didn't seem prudent to take on something quite so large. So I put it on the back burner until I received tenure and started to then do a lot more research into Woodstock West. Again, fascinated with that era, but also drawn to the idea of students having a voice and protest. As a feminist, that those kinds of issues are very important to me. And how would I encapsulate it? That was the second part of the question, Kate.
Oh, sort of, if you had to encapsulate from all of those conversations and all the interviews that you've done as part of the documentary, kind of what your sense of, like, what the event was like. Mostly this is just me cheating and asking you things that the students who work with the documents ask me when I'm teaching with them, so.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Jim certainly mentioned the fact that for many students, this was a defining moment in their lives, in their careers. Many students went on to follow careers centered on social justice, on political activism, on journalistic endeavors that were about getting at the truth of issues. Unpacking many of the lies from Vietnam, for instance. So those conversations are the ones that stand out to me. Though, of course, there are many others where students have shared with me that they enjoyed the party scene, the bands, the debate stages, the sitting around the campfires with their professors and other students debating the issues of the day. So all of that, I think, kind of bubbles to the surface when I think about the conversations that I had with many people who were there and witnessed things firsthand.
Thank you so much. Ved, as the only person who's on the panel who was a faculty member at the time, I'm curious kind of what the faculty mood and like, what was it like to be a faculty member? And just, so in preparation for this, I watched multiple times the Ken Burns, you know, Vietnam docu-series, and listening to, oh God, his name is escaping me. The faculty member who was a professor, I think, of geology at Kent State, who was trying to intervene and really get students to disperse to avert further bloodshed. Like, it just sounds horrible and heartrending. And I, obviously nothing like quite that tragic happened at the university, but I can't imagine that there was not, you know, sort of a similar sense of, you know, heightened anxiety and fear among the faculty, just in fear for student safety.
Those were rough days and tough days because faculties all around the country, many of them were torn because, as you remember, Nixon had given kind of a manifesto before he became the president that he was going to end the Vietnam War. And then he went to Cambodia and Congress enacted the law. And as law professors, that was an issue that was a burning issue for us. And as teaching international law and that Tonkin Gulf resolution, and I wrote about it all around the country. There was a great deal of criticism of what Nixon had done and what the Congress had done. But at that time, there was another faculty member whose name is Joe Page. Joseph Page went to Georgetown, and he and we participated in teach-ins, not only at Denver, but around the country. And then in Denver, when there were demonstrations, we were there. The university wanted us to have loyalty oath and sent it to me. And Joe and we said absolutely no. So we did not. They sent it second time. And after that, we did not sign it, and they did not come after us. But students, we were about 6 miles away from the campus, but there was a great deal of excitement at the law school as well. Along with excitement, there was kind of a fear. People were being drafted. There was all kind of issues that were happening. But activism at that time, even among law schools, were pretty high. And I was teaching at Cornell, and at that time it was the Graduate School of International Studies. And we had people from Africa, people from Latin America, from Europe, all over doing international studies, PhD and MA students. And there was again a great deal of stir, even in at Cornell also, at the Graduate School of International Studies. So students were activists. It was very exciting, but also kind of a period of uncertainty for students.
Thank you. So back to Jim, in preparing the sort of what photos I felt like I could include given the time constraints, one of the things that I noticed is that at least, I mean, obviously it's you in 1970, so you look a little different, but you don't see you almost anywhere, which I guess is probably because you were, running around coordinating and not necessarily participating. Can you talk about what, I think it changed names a couple times. First it was Strike Central, and then they started calling it like the comms base. What it was like to actually try and coordinate something that was that massive.
I think it's not coordinating it. That is what in fact happens in those situations. There were lots of different groups, a lot of different players. There was a full range of political views that often happens with these kinds of mass protests. I've spent a lot of time working internationally, and I actually see similarities between this Tiananmen Square and the 100,000 people in Sukbatar Square in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, that were demanding democracy 20 years ago. 30 years ago. And in the case of Denver, Woodstock West, it was democracy, in my opinion, it was democracy demonstrated. In the case of Tiananmen Square, it was democracy defeated. And in the case of Mongolia and Sukbatar Square, it was democracy achieved. And in all of those settings, it's very hard to coalesce and to create common leadership. So there were many different factions and groups. It was one of the most interesting things for me to have firsthand appearance, to understand how views could coalesce or how they wouldn't coalesce, the negotiating process. And it is a very important element of this, because ultimately the faculty and the students were in favor of five outcomes. And it was submitted to Maurice Mitchell, and he agreed to 4, but not the 5th. And it was a sign of the times and a sign of the situation and the players, because he felt he could reject the settlement by simply saying they can't reorganize on another place on the campus in a more proper setting or more controlled setting. And when that settlement failed, the reaction was, okay, the troops are coming on, what will happen? What violence will there be? And when I said earlier, everybody was out to make sure there was no violence. I would say 98% to 99%, but certainly some more radical folks were initially looking to firebomb buildings as it was occurring on other campuses. And over time, they realized that that was not going to happen, that the forces to avoid violence were stronger than the forces that were trying to create violence. So there's all these tugs and pulls and differing views. Along with VED, some of my great friends in the last 50 years, throughout the last 50 years, have been professors that were there at that time. Stuart James comes to mind, who was part of the negotiating team, as I was at one point. There were, of course, people who didn't understand all that intrigue and all that mechanism within the protest, and were purely celebrating and insisting upon showing their views and their opinions, which certainly had a place as well. I just wanted to mention, as was mentioned at the beginning, the university had we agreed that I would do a chronology of the events, and those details and that the insight to what was happening under the surface is represented in that 48-page chronology. And I know the university has it available, and anybody who's listening, I'm sure, can contact the library or me and get a copy.
Yeah, thankfully the DU Magazine story that came out on Monday has a link to it. So anybody who can, actually I think it's just all online now because no one can leave the house to print anything or mail it. But yeah, the chronology is available on I think it's magazine.du.edu.
Kate, I might add a footnote just in order to remind people that the 1960s, that era was the era of young people. Students all over the world, you remember or recall, had been protesting. That was the time when in France, in Paris was burning. Students all over were protesting. Change was in the air. And the young people were in ascendance. So that was the time when all over the world, in every country, it was young people who were seen as the not simply leaders of tomorrow, but who are going to build tomorrow. And that is the kind of setting in which this happened. Because when I came to Denver, at that time also, it was the young people, it was students that were seen as the ones who are going to create that kind of a future. And that is the setting when you find, as Jim rightly said, that there were many who were also trying to be creating revolution, and that is the setting. Ralph Nader came here. He stayed with us, this professor that I mentioned, Joseph. Joe Page and I, we had a small house, kind of an apartment that we lived in. And Ralph Nader was Joe's very good friend. And they are the ones who did that book on against cars and all that. So that was the kind of setting. I just wanted to have the context of young people being leaders at that time and ready to fight for a good cause.
So Ben, you, as I mentioned in the lecture, you taught a class in spring quarter of 1968 on Vietnam. And you mentioned before we started broadcasting that it was, I mean, it was open to graduate and law students, but you opened it to the community, and you said you had 70, 80 community members attend. What was that like? That's, people talk about community engaged learning like it's a new thing. You were doing it in 1968.
You know, that is one particular setting that I don't think that I've ever been able to repeat, because we had almost 70, 80, sometimes 100 people from the community. And as the lecture ended or the debate ended, people would be there for a long period of time. Sometimes it was a happy hour that would continue. And people would have wine and cheese and stay there for a long time at the law school. So that Vietnam law and policy seminar, I called it a seminar, but I had 150, 200 people there. So it was a very exciting period.
Kate, I want to mention another class. Dean Rice started a class at DU called The Black Experience in America.
Yes.
And he was, yes, he was recruiting student leaders, certainly not just African-American students, but student leaders across the spectrum. And that class, according to many of the sources that I spoke to, had a profound impact on how people viewed the world and their place in it. He had guests like Fannie Lou Hamer, Andrew, help me out.
I know Stokely Carmichael.
Andrew Young and Louis Farrakhan, important Black leaders at the time that came to campus that were a part of a similar experience that Ved was having in his class. And I think we have a lot to thank John Rice for. Because
he introduced his daughter, Condi, to me, who took one course at that time. And then she went to did MA, and then came back for PhD and had the second course. And as she became the Secretary of State, that is the day that she called my home and said that she is going to be doing on the international scene what she learned in international law. So, you know, Dean Rice, Condi Rice, I think about those days, and they were kind of wonderful days.
Fantastic. So I want to, there's a couple questions that came in through the Q&A. And since we have about 3 minutes left, I'm going to pick and choose a little bit. One of them is for Jim. So it says, as one of the coordinators, what was the response of the strikes organizers to the Black Panthers charge, Black Panthers / Black Student Alliance charge regarding the lack of comparable response to violence against Black students?
Oh, I think on that particular issue, there was an acknowledgement and a support of that particular claim or that assertion. There was, even though Denver was a pretty white campus, there was an appreciation for that discrimination. Much of what it wasn't solely the war that caused Woodstock West. I mean, the civil rights movement was a big part of it, a whole changing in views. I think the conflict that occurred maybe with the Black Panthers was the techniques of advocacy or protests that they represented. And I won't go into it, but there actually was a case in the student court over the Black Panthers. So there was even an attempt by the student regulatory system to somehow resolve some of those conflicts that existed within the groups. But I think it represented the time, and I would like to think that what we did had an impact in the future. Maybe not immediately. Nixon was reelected, but he ultimately, the war ended and he was removed from office. For many of us, our careers were set because of what happened there. My involvement with representing American Indian tribes, low-income housing, working with an emerging democracy. I don't think I'm unique, but there's also an understanding that, gee, it didn't go as far as we had hoped. And we're reminded by our children of that all the time.
That's definitely resonates with some conversations that I've had with my dad this past week, who, as I said, was about 25 in 1970. So we're just now at 3. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you so much for all the panelists for participating. Thank you for being patient with us as we threw this together fairly last minute, because we were, like I said, we were planning on doing a physical exhibit that people could come to, and that, you know, didn't work out on the anniversary. But I'm so glad that we could do this and be together, even if it's virtually. And I hope to see everybody in, again, fingers crossed, fall of next year, that we can all be together in at least a little bit more in person, and come together in a more in-person-y way around this event. Because I know alumni and advancement are looking at ways that they can sort of engage the class of 70 in ways that they just weren't able to this year. So Nancy, is there anything else that we need to say as we close ourselves out?
Nope, I just want to thank all of the panelists for doing this University Library Association lecture for the university libraries. This was great, and I think it's clear that people have a lot of questions and are really fascinated to learn more about this time. So we will, like Kate said, we will definitely be finding ways to bring us all together to discuss this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was
All right.
good to be with all of you. And to
Yes,
go
Thank you so
back over
much.
that period. Wonderful. Thank you.
great. Well, I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Please be safe and healthy and take good care. Thank you. Thank you.
Great job, Kate.
Thank you.